Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It's my pleasure to invite as a guest on the Jesus Changes Everything for this, another one of our The Gospel at Work segments, Mr. Tim Bryant. Welcome, Tim.
Good to be here.
Well, thanks. Tim is got a very interesting job. He works in radio, in news, as well as sportscasting, particularly or specifically with station WGAU in Athens, Georgia. Do you want to give us some sense of what's involved in your work in general there, Tim?
Well, the first thing, and it's the first question everybody asks, is what time do you get up? Because it's morning radio. I set the clock for 2 a.m. I'm frequently awake before that. So I'm in my office no later than 2:30 each morning, on the air between 6 and 10. Two parts to the day. One is preparing for the show, and the other is doing the show. And I enjoy both parts. I'm very much a student of preparation. I'm probably, I don't know, if you were to say which one am I better at, which do I enjoy more, I actually enjoy putting it together. It's like the work day is over once I get on the air and actually do the show. The work is in the preparation. I've come to really enjoy that.
Well, good. And so your morning drive time, and is it talk radio? Is it?
Yeah, it's talk. It's strictly talk. I'm not playing music. I'm interviewing local newsmakers, state newsmakers. A lot of commentary on local and state news. Some national discussion, but we try to be as local as we possibly can. We try to continue to be that old school local radio.
Gotcha. Well, I'm curious too. I'm sure some of our listeners are. How do you break into this kind of a gig? Besides being able to get up early.
Yeah, I got into radio 30 plus years ago. True story, I wanted to get into newspaper down in South Georgia. I wanted to get into newspapering. I was actually offered a job, a local newspaper, a little town called Bainbridge. It's near Tallahassee, Florida, extreme South Georgia. I was offered a job in the newspaper. At the same time, I was offered a job at the local radio station. And long story short, the radio station paid $10 a week more. And so 30 plus years later, I'm still in radio.
How about that? Well, I don't know how much you know your radio history, but the very first commercial radio station,
KDKA in Pittsburgh.
That's exactly right. That's what I grew up listening to during morning drive time with Jack Bogut and the annual Christmas fundraising drive for the Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. But the actual very first regularly scheduled radio broadcast was broadcast from Grove City, Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
At Grove City College, where I served on the radio there when I was a student at Grove City College. So I've got that on my resume. And then I also had a wonderful 3 months of morning drive time dealing with news. This was back in the early 2000s, and an interesting situation. A local Nazarene church in this small town in the tail of Virginia had been gifted a low wattage AM station, and my friend went in to see the pastor of the church, and he said, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, he said, "You're going to allow my friend and me to be on your radio station." And the fellow said, I'd like you to be on the radio station, and you're going to let us do the morning drive time. And he said, "I think you could be great for the morning drive time, and you're going to let us say whatever we want." And lo and behold, we got that slot, and we lasted from June of 2001 until September 12th. On September 12th, that was our last show in which we spoke rather forthrightly about the sovereignty of God in light of what had happened the day before. And some of the little old ladies at the church just couldn't handle that. And so we were no more. And that was the end of my radio career. But enough about me. As you know, in this segment, I like to ask people about how the gospel impacts you in your work context. And I've typically reminded my guests, I'm not asking you per se, and not that you can't talk about this, but I'm not asking you about evangelism with those around you, but more the question is, as you think about your own salvation, as you think about the grace of God in your life, how does that impact the way that you are interacting with others, whether it's coworkers, whether it's audience members, whether it's interviewees? How does that knowledge of your own dependence on the grace of God in Christ impact you when you're behind the mic?
Well, I'm looking for a word here. It's almost difficult. That's the word that comes to mind. It's almost difficult to the extent that I would need to separate the two. If you understand what I'm saying?
Sure, yeah, I understand that. Absolutely. That's why I don't completely cut it off.
Yeah, I have a secular day job, okay, and that's fine. Most people do actually have what we consider secular jobs, but I am increasingly, and this isn't the way I started. This is a continuing process. I think it's part of the process of sanctification, probably. I just find myself more completely viewing everything through that prism of a sinner who is saved by grace. That informs everything, and it's sometimes difficult. I try a couple of things. Number one is, even given that it is a secular radio show, we're talking about the events of the day, whether it's a street paving downtown or Afghanistan going to hell. It's still a secular radio show on a secularly owned radio station. I find myself sometimes trying to slip in and sneak in theological references, evangelical references, but more than not, I find myself having to consciously work to leave them out. Okay, wait a minute. Not everybody's on the same page here. Not everybody views this the way I do. Let me speak to the events as best I can and play the ball down the middle of the fairway as best I can. It's actually kind of a struggle sometimes to, and I know this sounds odd, especially on a podcast such as this. I sometimes struggle to keep it out. Right. Because it continually and increasingly informs the way I view almost everything. I don't mean that I'm looking at current events, local, nationally, internationally, whatever. I don't mean that I'm guilty of what some call newspaper eschatology. Right. I try to avoid that. But at the same time, it's just that every event that I see points me in the direction of the fact that we are fallen people in a fallen world, and as C.S. Lewis put it, as saved Christians, we are rebels in occupied territory. That informs most everything that I do, and most every way that I look at almost every event, to the point that I increasingly have to sometimes filter it out or try to just maintain an audience that isn't saying, "Oh boy, there he goes again."
Yeah. I get that completely, and I would actually concur with that. The challenge of leaving it out, when in some senses, in some contexts, there's a sense in which we're called to that. I have the blessing of being able to teach philosophy and ethics at a local community college here, and I've been unapologetic about wearing my faith on my sleeve, but I'm also very conscious of the fact that my employers didn't say, here's a soapbox, go evangelize. I have a responsibility to teach a certain content to these kids, but I'm really grateful that content gets me so close to real issues, and that this class, in fact, or these classes are really designed to get students to ask some of the big questions. And so, I have more opportunity than if maybe I was an accounting teacher or a math teacher. But at the same time, I want to be a honorable guest as a professor there. So I'm sure you feel much the same way in your work. Have you had any sort of difficult experiences where maybe tension was created because of as you brought your faith to bear on maybe a local issue or even a national issue?
Never that I can think of, literally never that I can think of on air. When I find myself called to the principal's office, it's because of something I said on Twitter or something I said on social media. That's where I tend to find myself called to the carpet. You can't say that. You can't do that. A recent example that comes to mind, I have a relatively, I think, a strictly narrow view of the number of genders. I happen to believe there are only two, and that they are immutable. You don't go changing them on a whim. And I express that from time to time on social media. And I'm told that for the sake of, how do I say this? For the sake of continued harmony in the workplace, I probably should avoid doing that.
Right. Yeah, that's and that's a very real challenge and difficulty, and part of the challenge for Christians living as rebels in occupied territory. To requote your Lewis quote, I'm a little put out that you beat me to a Lewis quote, but that's actually probably a good thing. It's a tough thing to know how to do, and let me ask you this: given the fact that you've had 30 years of experience, and I would also add, given that you are, at least now, and when you started, you're on the air, and I guess in kind of a strange place. In Athens, you are in the South, but you're also in a academic environment where maybe they're not so friendly to Christianity. But my question is, have you seen a change over the length of your career about how sort of welcome a Christian perspective may or may not be on the air?
What I have noticed, first of all, let me tell you about Athens. You're spot on in your assessment of Athens. It's a small, 130,000 people university town, not terribly far from Atlanta. It is, if you were to look at that political map, that red-blue map, it's a little blue dot in a red sea. Even now, surrounded by a lot of red counties, but Athens is a little blue dot, and it goes, and predictably, you can set your clock by it every 4 years, predictably 65-70% for the blue candidate in a given race. But to your question, the way thinking has evolved, the way reception has evolved, I would have to, and I'm going to give you a very self-centered answer. I can probably tell you more about how I have evolved over those 30 years than I could about how mores have changed, how responsiveness has changed. I don't know that to answer the larger question first, how is Christianity received in a given community? The old thing about Georgia being the buckle of the Bible Belt and all that kind of stuff. Again, it goes back to that political map. You get out of town, you got out of Athens, and that's not to say that there aren't Christians in Athens, that there isn't a very, very vibrant Christian community in it. But if you really want to find people who think probably the way that you and I do about many, if not most, of some of the big issues, theologically speaking, you get out of town, you get out into the rural parts of the state, you get down to where I grew up down in South Georgia, and you find an audience that has always been receptive. You find an audience that is always not just receptive to and respectful to, but seeking the kind of let me put it this way: if there had been podcasts in the 70s when I was growing up, your father would have been the number one with a bullet on those chunks. That was the kind of field in which I grew up, and in which, frankly, from which, and this is hardly a unique story, perhaps you could speak to it, there was a degree of rebellion. There was a measure of rebellion. I always like to say it this way: I grew up in a Baptist home, in a Baptist church. It was literally, our church was literally a block away. My mom played the piano in that church. If it was open, we were in it. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. We were in that church anytime it was open. And you get to the point, you become a teenager. You, as I like to say, you read enough Freud to be dangerous, and you begin to be skeptical. And this is not for me. This is a bunch of people with third-grade educations yelling and screaming at each other. I'm way too sophisticated for this. I never went off the deep end into full-blown atheism. I was more honest than that, as I like to think in those days. I was an agnostic. I dabbled in that for a good long time. I simply don't know, and it can't be known. That was my view of things. And as God would direct, he continued to, over the years, put people in my path who would point me in the right direction, who would challenge my views, people of faith. I didn't even know the word then, but people who turned out to be Christian apologists, who would challenge my tenacious belief that whether there is a God or not, whether there is objective truth or not, all those things, I would believe, well, that's unknowable. And they would know it's plenty knowable, and here's how you can know. And they would make and present credible cases to the point where it became very difficult for me to ignore. And very long story short, I just found myself really at some point becoming immersed. I don't mean to say that I've spent a lifetime studying this stuff, but I did kind of a deep dive into a lot of Christian apologetics. It is still very much a passion of mine. I should devote more time to it than I do. But I came to understand that there is a very logical and rational, and to use the word intellectual underpinning for what we believe. It isn't blind faith. It isn't blind faith at all. It's informed faith. And it took me decades to come to that point, but thank God, and I do mean that literally, here I am today.
Well, that's terrific. And I'm guessing that in a sense, maybe encourages a level of patience and a level of hope, just not maybe feeling like you're banging your head against a wall, insofar as your work leads you to interact with those who are where you were.
I would quibble with the use of the word patience. I'm not possessed with a great degree of that, frankly. And this is, I heard Vodi Bakum once describe apologetics, Christian. He said apologists are like shock troops, and they have this reputation, he says, of being the jerks of the Christian world. I tend to, once I settle on it, once I've made my mind up about something, once I have come to see something, it is exceedingly frustrating to me that you don't see it that way. And patience is not a word that I would use when referring to me in that respect.
Well, maybe
that thing that Peter says, 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready with an explanation. I got that part. It's the being ready with an explanation with the, how does he say it, grace and
yes,
and respect. That's the part I'm still working on.
Right, and he goes out to strengthen the brethren, mindful of his own failures. And so, yeah, I maybe I should, instead of assuming I should just be preaching this to you, to remind you as you're interacting with maybe some pointy-headed intellectuals that you know what it's like to be a pointy-headed intellectual, and God was gracious and patient with you and drew you in. I do think that there is that sense in which we feel like we have a choice between sort of surrender, acquiescence, where we're coming into the secular world and giving away the store for the sake of being perceived to be nice, or we're going through the jugular and trying to destroy the people we're supposed to be trying to win. And there's definitely another option, a calling upon us that from my perspective, again, dealing with college students, my posture is from beginning to end to seek to undo that idea of the Christian faith that presents itself as, I have found a better way to live, you need to come follow me, but instead say to them, I'm just as awful as you are. The only difference between you and me is that by God's grace, my awfulness has been covered. Let me tell you how you can have yours covered too.
The thing that I've come to learn is this, and this brings me back to the question of apologetics. Apologetics is great for winning an argument. It's great for winning a debate, but that's not what we're called to do. I mean, that's not what hey, good job winning that debate. It feels good to know that you have prevailed in argument, but we're not called to win debates. We're called to help win souls. And that does require, as you say, there is a middle ground, and you don't have to be all gas, no brakes all the time.
There are these wonderful moments for me in the classroom where I can see the students realizing, wait a minute, the sort of the consensus, the general wisdom that I've drunk from the broader culture isn't quite as substantial and well-grounded as I thought. And here's this guy who's overt in his Christian faith, who's not afraid of the sort of bromides that I bring from the world. Especially, I mean, I've told my students in my ethics classes, one of the ways that I approach it is my desire is for all of you to be more deliberate in your ethical thinking, to be more consistent with your own convictions in your ethical thinking. And I want you to learn something that I know, and that's that we all judge unfairly. We judge other people more harshly than we judge ourselves. We're all relativists when we want to do wrong, and we're all objectivists when someone tries to do us wrong. And we need to be consistent and coherent. But then to go from there to, I tell them, I want you to come away from this class not buying into a relativistic ethic because it's dumb. And I don't want you even embracing a consequentialist ethic, an ethic that's essentially pragmatic. It's also dumb. And I'm not afraid, again, of all the sort of cultural momentum that you have for those ideas because they're dumb and they're easy to refute. But I'm going to refute them with a smile on my face and a perspective that says, aren't we silly that we buy this nonsense? Not, you're dumb and you should be smart like me.
Yeah, and that is, and again, my objective, anytime we get into any kind of a discourse, you may note this on social media with me and other people, the objective is win, right? I mean, okay, no, you're wrong, I'm right, here's why. And I'm going to club you over the head with it until you acquiesce. And I've learned in multiple years of marriage now, that doesn't work at the personal level. A little physiological level.
Yeah, I think so too. And another sort of strategy that helps me sometimes, obviously not all the time, but sometimes I look, particularly in social media engagement, I look at it as a test. Can I be sufficiently winsome? Can I be, avoid the snark and the sarcasm? Can I actually encourage, particularly when you're dealing with a brother in Christ, can I encourage this person? But even when you're not, can I be a friend to this person that I'm trying to refute? And it's a wonderful exercise. And again, it helps us all remember where we once were. And I think that's vitally important to never lose sight of, what Paul says, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us, that we were dead in our trespasses and sins, that we didn't, as much as we might study apologetics, as much as we might, master the flaws in unbelieving worldviews, none of us, not a one of us, smarted our way into the kingdom.
No, exactly right. We're not going to impress God with our wisdom. No, and back to the point about apologetics. It's a good point you made that in interacting not with non-believers or agnostics, but interacting with fellow believers who maybe have different views on certain points of doctrine. One of the things that I came to learn fairly early on about apologetics, you may or may not sway an unbeliever with your argument, but I honestly think that apologetics are not so much for unbelievers as for believers. It's there as an intellectual pursuit, if you will. It's there to remind us why we should have faith in what we believe.
Yes, and to remind us that we don't need to be intimidated. We don't need to be afraid. When the Bible says the fool says in his heart there is no God, that should really push back against that sort of presumed intellectual superiority of the academic leadership who rejects the Christian faith. There's a whole lot of fearfulness in the church that we bought into this idea that we're the dumb ones. And the devil is there to encourage us to be fearful in our dumbness, but prideful when we begin to push back against our dumbness. And we need to hang on to the that G.K. Chesterton line, we've misplaced the organ of humility, and instead of applying humility to our ambitions, we apply it to our convictions. And we need to be confident in the things that we're proclaiming and uncertain about our own superiority. So, well, Tim, I've really enjoyed this conversation. We are running out of time. I'm excited to know that you're active, that you're doing this, that you're thinking in terms that you're describing. It's one of the things that comes out of this segment and this podcast and having a guest like you on. I want my readers to know, in a sense, to meet the 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal, in a manner of speaking. I want them to know there are people in places you may not know about who are faithful, who are diligent, who are doing the work of the ministry. You're one of those guys. I thank you for your faithfulness. If people want to tune in, I don't know if your WGAU is on iHeartRadio, but if people want
Absolutely, yes. We stream live at our website, WGAUradio.com. Any number of apps on which you can stream us live. I have a podcast. It's been down for a few months. It just within the last few days has popped back up. It's mostly conversations with local newsmakers, but it's there as well. Any number of streets into my neighborhood, as I like to say.
Okay, terrific. Well, and if people want to follow you on Twitter,
yeah, at Tim Bryant Radio. At Tim Bryant Radio. I have literally dozens of followers.
Dozens. Okay. Well, I hope out of the many dozens of subscribers to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast that you'll see a radical change in that number. Tim, thank you so much for being with me. Thank you for your faithful work. I ask that God bless you and your family and the city of Athens as well.
Thank you so much.
You betcha.
You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.